So our panel today is titled Bisexuality Plus on the Screen and in Your Earbuds. And our first speaker is Meret, and she will present on Heartstopper, which is a favorite of mine. So I'm very, very eager to listen to your presentation. So Meret is a bisexual researcher and writer with a Master of Science degree in Media and Communications from Lund University in Sweden. She also holds a degree in English and Literature, and her interest lies in media representation and audience studies, particularly related to queer media. Other than writing about bisexuality in an academic context, she also writes poetry in which her identity plays a significant role. And we will have a final poetry moment to conclude our weekend, so that's also included. So Meret, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. There we go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Brilliant. Then Canva always takes a bit of time. There we go. Yeah, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here. So as Azia already said, my name is Meret. My pronouns are she, her, and I have a Master's of Science degree in Media and Communication Studies from Lund University. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about my thesis work, actually, titled I'm Bi, actually, Combating Bisexual Erasure and the Impact of Representation in Netflix's Heartstopper, which is really topical because the third season of Heartstopper actually came out 2 days ago. So you don't need any previous knowledge on Heartstopper to listen to the presentation today, but I highly recommend it nevertheless. So what I'm going to talk you through today is, first of all, the premise, kind of like an introduction to my research, before I get into the nitty-gritty and explain a little bit about the methods, the theory, and the analysis without alienating anyone who doesn't have a background in media or cultural studies. So I won't get into the details. And then lastly, I'll talk about the outcome, the most important part, the findings and the conclusion from my research. So the premise, as I already said, this was my master thesis, and I wrote it on the impact of media representation, the media representation of bisexuality in the context of Heartstopper. And I think we're all aware that there are more LGBTQ+ stories on screen now. However, there has actually been a decline in recent years, so we're kind of moving backwards a little bit. And there is still a distinct lack of bisexual representation. So for instance, while bisexual people make up almost 60% of the LGBTQ+ community, only 25% of queer characters on screen openly identify as bi. One of them being Nick Nelson, one of the main characters in Heartstopper, who you can see in the corner down there. And I think we all can agree that not all representation is necessarily good representation. However, Heartstopper specifically, as both the graphic novel series and also the Netflix adaptation, has been widely hailed as an example of good representation, and specifically nuanced representation, which I'll talk about later as well. So that is the premise of my study, and getting into the nitty-gritty, what I really wanted to find out in my thesis work was, how do bisexual individuals engage with Heartstopper? How do they watch it? How do they feel about it? What are their practices as an audience of Heartstopper? And then how do they evaluate the bisexual representation, particularly through the character of Nick? And do they think it's good representation? What constitutes good representation in the media? And then lastly, what role does that representation play in their identity perception, their identity validation, and their sense of belonging within the LGBTQ+ community? And in order to find out the answers to those 3 questions, I interviewed 12 bisexual individuals. 8 of them identified as women, 2 as men, and 2 as non-binary. And the theories that I used to analyze my data included identity and representation theory from Stuart Hall, media engagement, and I used a social constructivist lens, meaning that the social is constructed also through media. So the way we see reality is shaped by media. Moving on into the really exciting part, what did I actually find out in my study? So representation in the media was actually a motivation for engagement. So a lot of the participants said that they watched Heartstopper specifically because they knew that there was queer representation and there was bisexual representation in there. So it shows us that for queer people, it really drives our engagement with media to see ourselves represented on the screen. The participants had developed a really strong emotional connection to the series and to Nick as a bisexual character because they felt that it was positive, relatable, and specifically nuanced representation. So Nick as a character is not only defined by being bisexual, he is also defined through lots of other things, and he's a complex character, meaning he's not a token character. And that is something that really stood out to this audience and made them feel like it was good representation of being bisexual without relying on common stereotypes. And that was actually the one thing that everyone mentioned as the reason why Heartstopper is good representation. It subverts and it challenges stereotypes about bisexuality. I think we've all come across the very loathed stereotypes of the greedy, promiscuous, cheating bisexual, and those stereotypes are not only subverted, but directly addressed in Heartstopper. So therefore, it makes a case of very nuanced representation. It shows the life of one bisexual individual, and even though we're all different, it shows us that being bi can be a part of our identity without being the only thing that defines us. So visibility for this audience was really important. Also beyond the fictional example of Nick Nelson, they also talked about Kit Connor, the actor who portrays Nick, and his experiences with monosexism and bisexual erasure. So therefore, Kit Connor as a real-life example also played a really big role in this audience's engagement with Heartstopper. Moreover, previous negative portrayals, like I said, tied to those stereotypes of the promiscuous, cheating, greedy bisexual, had had an impact on this audience's perception of their own bisexual identity. They felt like they weren't queer enough and that there were hierarchies in the community, meaning that gay and lesbian individuals were placed on a higher rung than bisexual individuals. They also reported double discrimination from both queer and straight people and spaces, and that they had experiences with monosexism, so being kind of forced to pick a side, either choosing gay or straight for themselves, and compulsory monosexuality, having to adhere to this societal idea that you have to be either or, and there can't be anything in between. They also said that for them, media representation was definitely complicit in their experiences of biphobia, bi-negativity, and bi-erasure, and that on the other hand, positive portrayals like Heartstopper provided empowerment for them and validation and made them feel more comfortable in their own identity. They also highlighted the importance of nuanced representation for the normalization of bisexuality. So not only was it important for their own identity, their own feeling of belonging, it was also really important to normalize bisexuality as a valid and stable identity as a whole. And then lastly, the wider implications of my study were that representation truly matters. And it matters not only in numbers, but in terms of quality. So more representation doesn't necessarily mean good representation. And what good representation constitutes is really personal, but it's usually what feels authentic to the community and what's not reduced to stereotypes or that characters are only included as token characters. It also showed that Black and white thinking is detrimental to communities like the bi+ community. So thinking that there is no gray space between the Black and the white is really detrimental for communities that exist in the colorful spaces in between. And there needs to be more emphasis on fluidity and this in-betweenness, which also applies to lots of other identity markers, but stood out specifically in this context of identity. And it also showed me as a researcher that the bi+ community has really felt starved of media representation, starved of representation in academia, which is why I think that conferences and events like today are really important to promote the exchange on these topics, to make sure that bi voices are heard and valued, and making sure that we can give back to the community. Lastly, in case you're interested, here's a non-exhaustive list of some of the sources that I used in my project. If you have any specific questions about the nitty-gritty, feel free to reach out to me. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Meret. Thank you also for this Nick Nelson smiling final image. He is the cutest. Okay, so I mean, I have many questions, but I will save them for later. So now we have our next speaker. We are a bit out of the original order in the program. So we have Kushiba Jaj, and I think that we have a kind of a technical change. So Aurelio should the slides.
Yes, I'm definitely trying.
Where?
Okay.
You should be able
Okay.
to share them.
Be able to share.
Yeah.
Okay. Can everybody see these?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And I see Koshi coming on the screen. So let me introduce her very, very quickly. So Koshi Bajaj holds a MSc in Media and Communications from the London School of Economics and is interested in questions surrounding social justice, inclusive media and policy, and intersectional politics. She has previously contributed to the Global Challenges Research Fund publication, Notes for the Media, Ordinary Indians on the Reporting of Sexual Violence. And today she's presenting on, let me read your title, Invisibly Present, a cultural analysis of 3 movies with M-Spec female characters in Bollywood. And boy, do I love a title with parentheses. So I'm very excited to hear what you're about to present to us. The floor is yours, Kushi.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Aurelio, for presenting the slides. I do want to apologize in advance in case you hear some sound in the background. I am currently traveling, but I really wanted to present this live. So, okay, let's start. As you can see from my abstract, the Supreme Court of India read down the colonial law and decriminalized queer sex in 2018, but storytellers and filmmakers have been attempting to bring LGBTQ plus narratives to the forefront since long before that. Now, unfortunately, most of these attempts have reinforced the Western patriarchal binary of people being either gay or straight, and that has led to an invisibilization of bi, pan, and other M-spec narratives in the subcontinent. So this paper is going to look at 3 movies, and we're going to see and contextualize and critique, the portrayals of these M-spec identities, and we're going to place them in historical and contemporary socio-political context to see what the implications are and how the complex ecology within which these films have existed have influenced them and how they have influenced it. So yeah, could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so I thought for the introduction, it would be helpful for us to just have a basic timeline of how cinema has been in India so far. But I'm also going to contextualize that with Section 377. So in 1861, which is when India was under the colonial British rule, is when this section came in, it was introduced. It was sort of seen as a way of quote unquote protecting people in the army, but that's really not what it did, right? And in 1913, we had the first full-length film made in India, which was Raja Harishchandra. And it took more than 50 years after that. 1971 is when we had the first Indian film addressing queerness. So, and even at that point, it was commercially not successful, even though the critic reviews, some were very positive, some were not. And post 1971, we've had films that hint at queerness and or just at a deviation from cis heteronormativity, but it's often been in joke form. One of the most successful commercial films that talk about queerness is one that sees it as a gag, which is Dostana. So yeah, not doing great there. And in 2018, after decades of advocacy activism, legal battles, finally, Section 377 were read down. So post 2018, we've had more characters who are explicitly queer in commercial cinema, but the emphasis has still been on single gender attraction, and that's a huge problem because even if you look at the way that uh, the entire reporting around Section 377 happened, it was very focused on this idea of um, single gender attraction being allowed, or the fact that people can now be homosexual. So, yeah, that's what the dominant narrative has been. Can we move to the next slide, please? So, I'm going to just quickly say that this paper is going to do a cultural analysis. Like I mentioned in my abstract, it's going to look at the socio-political context within which these films were created and produced. Next slide, please. I'm gonna quickly touch upon three research papers that have informed my own research. The first is one that spoke about how bisexual behavior on screen is often seen by society to be single gender attraction behavior. I think this is really important to note, right? Because um, when we don't say bi, or when we just go forward with the idea of behavior, the reinforcing of heteronormative hierarchies happens in such a way that the assumption is that, oh, so this character has been attracted to this one gender throughout. And this is a surprise reveal that we're now getting. The second paper basically speaks about how bi individuals need micro affirmations from sources that are interpersonal, intrapersonal, and institutional. And if we think about it, media is such a huge institution in any country. And in India, especially with the cinema industry being one of the biggest in the world, any affirmation or representation on screen is exceptionally relevant to how it informs the societal context and vice versa. And the third thing that we're going to look at is Kitsy's framework of how the normative idea of being bi is reinforced through cinema. So this is divided into three parts. The first is identity expression, which talks about what you do, so what the actual behavior is. The second is visibility, who you see, but also who sees you. Again, I'm really sorry about the background sound. I hope it's not too distracting. The third thing is the idea of how out you can be, right? And if you think about it, all these three things are kind of tied to each other because even behavior has an element of outing you, or you deciding to sort of be visibly out through your behavior. And when we see characters on screen, they don't often come with labels. So what we get is that behavior and how that is or isn't making certain identities visible. Can we please go to the next slide? Okay, so the first film that we're going to look at is Fire. It came out in 1996, and it was directed by Deepa Mehta. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll do a summary really quickly. So it's the story of two women, Radha and Sita. They end up marrying an elder brother and younger brother. They struggle with the traditional wife stereotype, and they're stuck in loveless and desireless relationships with their husband because Radha's husband has taken a vow of celibacy and Sita's husband is having an affair. Now, as the women get an opportunity to learn more and more about each other, we get to see like an emotional and physical intimacy developing, and a relationship is established between them. The climax of the film revolves around this relationship being found out and the women ultimately choosing to leave the oppressive environment to be together. Next slide, please. Now, even as I was reading the summary of the film, you must have heard me say that they were loveless marriages or they were desireless marriages, but not from the women's end, right? It was from the men's end. So clearly, there's a yearning shown in that movie where the women want that desire from their husbands, or they want to have that relationship of love. And yet, because the movie ends with the two women choosing to be together, it's instead touted as one of India's first lesbian films. That's how it's been reported in global media and in national media. And the entire conversation around it has not been on the M spec. Something that's really interesting is that this film won the most popular Canadian Film Award at the Vancouver Film Festival. The reason for this is that the director is Indian Canadian. But it's also interesting of how a film that's about MSpec can be rated as a Western film, even in the context of it being shot by and having Indian artists in it. When it wins the award, it could have won just the most popular film award, but it kind of takes the director's dual identity of being an Indian Canadian and reduces it to just a Canadian identity. Then we have what actually happened when the film released in India, right? So there was a lot of vandalism and protests by right-wing Hindutva organizations like Bajrang Dal and Shiv Sena. The film was seen as being against Hinduism. The names of the characters are Sita and Draupadi, both of which are characters that are from both of which are characters that have their names from Indian mythology stories, epics to be more specific. Sita specifically coming from a holy story known as the Ramayana. So the idea was seen as not just the women of today, but also specifically going back to corrupt mythological narratives. Of course, as people who research on queer theory, we understand that this idea of one sacred narrative of or a purest form of mythology is extremely flawed, because that serves to only uphold certain power structures, and in this case a dualism of single gender attraction. And the other thing was that the highest grossing film of this year was Raja Hindustani. And that was the commercial film that released this year. And it actually focused on mocking queerness through two of the side characters. Neither of the characters was explicitly said to be queer, but they were extremely queer coded. And their queerness is fixed by the end of that film. So that turned out to be the highest grossing film. And this film was the screenings were banned. People were not allowed to go in. The director ended up submitting like a petition to the Supreme Court for safety. She conducted a candle march for the film. It's really important to note that the criticism that was coming to this film, or the way that it was being seen as a film that's going against morality by the opposition, was very focused on biphobic ideas. So, for example, saying things like, if women start fulfilling each other's sexual desires and needs, then the institution of marriage will crumble. So, this idea of fluidity of desire was present in the critique as well, but never, not once, was the identity explicitly mentioned on screen. So biphobia was coming through to bi viewers without bi representation coming to them. And the film ended up still today, till this day, is called as India's first lesbian film, which feels like a really inaccurate title for the film to hold, because there's clear M-spec attraction in it. Can we please go to the next slide? The next one that I'm going to talk about is Margarita with a Straw. It's been directed by Shonali Bose. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this film came out in 2014. To contextualize it within Indian cinema, the highest grossing film of this year was PK, which is about an alien who comes to Earth and basically makes visible the absurdity of social norms, because us as real humans making that visible isn't enough. Someone has to be extraterrestrial to point those things out. But the people who were pointing those things out were the director and cast of Margarita with a Straw. Shonali Bose is a bi director, which made a huge difference in this film because the characters were explicitly called bi. And the film has a very specific focus on intersectionality, because we see the main character, whose Bildung's romance story this is, has a disability. They are a person with cerebral palsy, and we see them navigating desire on the M-spec, as well as understanding their own identity and navigating their own emotions. So this idea of a Bildung's romance story, moving away from Bollywood and Indian cinemas focus on cishet male characters only getting coming of age stories, or those being the only coming of age narratives that are valid, but instead focusing on blurring those hierarchies was really, really essential. This was also a post-Dostana film. Dostana, like I mentioned, that's a film where that was a huge commercially successful film, which was about two men faking to be gay to rent an apartment, but then falling in love with a woman, which essentially mocked the entire community. And to see a film like this come out in the post Dostana landscape was really refreshing. It's also interesting the way that intersectional desire has been captured in this film, because that challenges the idea of hierarchies even more. The idea of okay, why would a person who has a disability experience desire at all, right? Because we are monolithic beings with only singular aspects to our identities. I think another important thing to note about this film in terms of its cultural grounding is that it challenges borders in more ways than one. So not only does it show us by Indian characters, it also shows us a character who falls for a Bangladeshi Pakistani lover, which means that it subverts the political divisions between the two countries, sort of in the same way that it subverts the idea of cis heteronormativity. So, yeah, I mean, that was a great one to watch, and I definitely recommend this film. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this was just a quick summary of the movie. I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it since we've spoken about it in detail. Yeah, can we please go to the next slide? Okay, so in the same year, in 2014, we got De Rishkia, which was a commercial film. It's very important to note the distinction between what is seen as art house cinema and commercial cinema in India, because usually art house cinema has less focus on budgets, as they're seen as indie films are, and has more space for expression. So Margarita with a Straw that we just spoke about was art house, and this was a commercial film. Can we go to the next slide, please? So a quick summary: Iftikhar and Babban are an uncle-nephew duo. They are criminals on the run. Iftikhar falls in love with Begum Apara, and Babban falls in love with her lady-in-waiting. Ultimately, it turns out that the two women have been out-conning the two cons, and they run away with the money together. It is heavily hinted that the two of them are lovers, but this is not confirmed. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, I think the first thing to culturally ground this film would be to talk about how it uses queerness as a surprising reveal, right? In the same year where we got Margarita with a Straw, which explicitly says the word bisexual, the commercial film that came out, which showed an M-spec character, used their queerness as the climax itself. The twist in the tale, the idea of it being something that is exotic, something that is almost kind of the way that Edward Said talks about the West's obsession with Orientalism. That's the same way that the director approaches the way that M-spec identities are on the spectrum of sexuality, with seeing it as something other, seeing it as something exotic, something that in itself can be the twist in a story. Also, there's huge queer coding, but the identities are not said at any point. And being sexual and being bisexual is seen as a way to trap men. But also the film, because it never says the word lesbian or bisexual, ends up reinforcing the idea that queer behavior on screen is seen as single gender attraction. There's also a lot of conversation about homonationalism if you look at the three films that I've looked at, because when Fire came out, the idea was that it's going against Hindu culture, right? But then to be able to make the argument to support the film, people would say that no, but Indian culture has always had queer identities if you look at the temples, etc. Now those queer identities then become grounded in a very certain idea of who is the Indian queer, and that queer comes from the fact that, oh, in Hinduism there was always this idea of everyone being accepted. But this is a film that has Muslim queer characters. And it's very interesting because it didn't end up facing the kind of backlash for its queerness that Fire faced. Of course, Fire had more explicit desire being shown on screen, but even at the end of the day, this question of the idea that, okay, this is an exotic thing that the other does who doesn't fit in under the homo national umbrella, and therefore they can be an M-spec character, is sort of what the conversation then becomes. And even in the presence of this identity, the articles that were written were about this film were very focused on, oh, this film shows female empowerment because the women end up together, not implying that there's no romantic or sexual connection between the two women. It's a very male gazy film because it was made by Abhishek Chaubey, and it kind of sees the desire between the two women as being something that could possibly be titillating or exciting or interesting to other people. So, yeah, could we please move to the next slide? Essentially, what conducting a cultural analysis of these three films tells us is the first thing is that we need bi gays for bi portrayal on screen. We need M-spec writers, directors, artists to be involved in the making of films, because even though Margarita with a Straw and Derishka came out in the same year, the having a bi female director made all the difference. The second thing is that movies that have come out after decriminalization still aren't saying bi in commercial cinema, because in 2014 we had a film before the decriminalization happened that said bi, and yet it's not happening now. So the only difference seems to be who is making the film and where the budgeting of the film is coming from. In commercial cinema today, the movie often comes from studios established by Western companies, and the entire focus is very much on profiting and therefore to catering to a mass audience, which means that minorities and people on the margins are often marginalized. There's also a need for bi-affirming portrayals. Uh, in the canon of Indian queer cinema, Fire would have been an amazing example to call it a bi-affirming portrayal, but instead it ended up being a film that's about people choosing to leave their husbands for this woman and now somehow turning into a lesbian, which is not what the film says, but what the narrative around it has become, unfortunately. It's a beautiful film, though, another one that I would definitely recommend. And we also need more accessible screenings because there needs to be a further blurring of the lines between art house and commercial cinema. If there isn't the pressure of doing numbers on a film, then it can often have more room for fluid expression. And it would be good to see like uh, OTT platforms or maybe independent grants supporting queer filmmakers more to tell their stories. And we come back to one of the things that we started with, which is that we need bi characters in films or M-spec characters in films to have three things. We need their behavior to be bi, we need them to be visible, and we need them to be out. And of course, not everyone identifies with labels, and that's perfectly okay. There are other ways to show a character being out, for example, the other characters around them being familiar with the fact that they're on the M-spec, etc. So we need these three things in cinema for a film to be bioforming, and we need that to make the cultural landscape within which cinema in India is made more inclusive, more socially just, and more affirming. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Koshi. Thank you also for joining us from your travels. We very much appreciate the effort. So stay with us if the gods of the travels allow, and see if there are some questions. I already see some appreciation in the chat, so I'm sure there will be a question at the end of this. So let me give the floor to our next presenter, Rowan Dowling. So hello, I see you. You should be able to share your screen if you have any slide. So Rowan is a DPhil candidate and lecturer at the University of Oxford. Their thesis research investigates bisexual history and culture in Russia between 1993 and 2023. So very contemporary span of years. And today they're going to present on bisexuality, the nation, and the crisis of masculinity in Russian audiovisual culture. So we are moving to another part of the planet. And Rowan, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Just trying to press something else and Zoom is getting in the way. All right, there we go. So yeah, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, and today I'm going to be talking about 2 Russian films made in the 2000s which featured male bisexual protagonists. So this paper has been developed from my broader thesis project on bisexuality in Russian culture and history from 1993 to 2023. And just to give you some quick context, I chose those dates because they mark a 30-year period which begins with homosexuality being decriminalized in Russia and ends with all LGBTQ+ topics essentially being outlawed. So today, queerness is sadly branded as the extremist activity of foreign agents. And due to censorship and erasure, the bisexual community in Russia, to the extent that there is a community at all, has unfortunately been allowed no sense of its own history. Yet bisexuality can be found in Russian culture, and the second part of my thesis proposes a canon of Russian language bisexual cinema and literature. So the 2 films that I'm talking about today, You I Love from 2004 and Closed Spaces from 2008, both use male bisexuality to work through discourses that were widely circulating at the time about the moral and societal implications of the free market and the idea that homosexuality was being imported into Russia through fashion trends and foreign influence. So you'll see that while the 2 films share some themes, the way that they treat these topics, their conclusions, their tones, their attitudes towards queerness are all vastly different. You I Love revolves around the introduction of a homosexual coded Kalmyk man named Ulimji into the relationship between 2 Russians, the bisexual coded man Timofey and his ethnically Russians, I should say, bisexual coded man Timofey and his heterosexual coded partner Vera. The film is significant not only as Russia's first quote-unquote gay movie, a point that I'll return to in a moment, but as one of the clearest examples of a bisexual love triangle being used to work through these kind of geopolitical and economic ties in Russia. Over the course of the film, Timofey's bisexuality comes to embody the uncertain future of Russia. So as Brian James Bear wrote in his brief analysis of the film in his 2009 book, Other Russias, Timofey is depicted not only as a cosmopolitan bisexual, but as the Russian 2-headed eagle incarnate. So he's torn between a simpler East and a commercial West. As well as obviously homosexuality and heterosexuality, as bisexuals always are. So if bisexual plots and characters are so clearly doing so much work to interrogate Russia's place in the New World Order, how is it that the film still gets talked about as Russia's first gay movie? Well, firstly, the movie was groundbreaking in terms of its largely sympathetic portrayal of queer male protagonists and the extent to which they showed the 2 men's moments of intimacy on screen. But secondly, Timofey's same-sex and not same-sex desires are not given equal treatment, as Vera and Ulimji represent diverging sexual and marketplace desires. So here on the left, you can see a still from the first time that Timofey and Vera have sex, a year before Timofey meets Ulimji. Vera's consumerism is literalized by her obsession with food. So she eats from this pile of green apples as they're having sex on a bedspread that's also got a green apple print. And that's how they consummate their relationship for the first time. And these real and fake apples cement the conflation of sexual and consumer desires, and they transform this kind of 3-dimensional passion into a 2-dimensional pattern. By contrast, when Ulimji and Timofey first have sex, they growl and jump at one another. They kind of playfully spray each other with water in the bath, and they ultimately end up nestled beneath a pile of fur rugs on the floor, as you can see here. Ulimji is actually associated with animals in this kind of Orientalist manner throughout the film, whether it's due to his position as a cleaner at the zoo, his childhood herding sheep, or Timofey's gift to him of a small cowbell necklace. And that connection with animals amplifies the sense that through his imagined Eastern simplicity, he allows Timofey to act on his nature too, this kind of wild same-sex sexual urges which Russian society has otherwise not allowed him to explore. The film was actually released with two endings, one for Russian cinemas and one for the international English language DVD. The original Russian release ends with Ulimji's uncle crying because his nephew is gay. This uncle is used to depict Kalmyk culture as unsympathetic and homophobic to the extent that he kidnaps Ulimji and forces him into the Russian army. Homosexuality is thus shown to be possible for Ulimji only in the Moscow metropolis, away from what is imagined as a more strictly traditional culture as yet untouched by Western commercialization and sexualization. This original ending provides little possibility for queer happiness within Russia, as it leaves Ulimji in the army and Timofey with Vera having had the choice made for him. Yet the true ending outrightly rejects pressures to resolve the love triangle with a coupled conclusion. Instead, it depicts a future in which Timofey, Vera, and Ulimji have managed to set up a co-parenting arrangement. And this brief epilogue, which is set 2 years after the main events of the film, envisions a harmonious queer family dynamic where jealousy has been resolved and the various kind of romantic, sexual, platonic elements of their relationships have flourished. So while directors revealed in interviews that Timofey's bisexuality was supposed to make the story relatable to any viewer because they thought all men are bisexual, basically, like any person is bisexual. The ending was ultimately deemed too radical for Russian audiences. And our second case study, Closed Spaces, shows us maybe why. So that film draws on emo aesthetics to vocalize all these anxieties concerning societal decline and obsession with wealth and the crisis of masculinity, which have apparently left the Russian youth in this lonely like spiral of self-destruction. Set over the course of 2 days, the film follows these two young adults, Venya and Vika, as they form an intense romantic and sexual relationship based on mutual disdain for society, their parents, and their lives. However, Venya also has a boyfriend, Rostik, who has continued to care for him even when Venya rejected his affection, acted impulsively, and tried to harm himself. And it's suggested in the film that Venya's bisexuality is another marker of mental illness alongside his agoraphobia. So in a flashback, we see that his anxiety is particularly triggered in the crowds of an American-style shopping mall, where he kind of hyperventilates pressed up against display windows, and it's only the blank faces of store mannequins who are staring back at him. They're all wearing the latest kind of global fashions, but they're offering no human connection in this empty world of kind of commerce, glass, and self-occupied consumers. His psychiatrist believes that heterosexual sex will cure him, and so Venya devises a plan to capture and just slight trigger warning for mentions of things that rape the pizza delivery girl Vika. So Venya and Vika each threaten each other with rape at different points in the movie, as well as preparing to stab each other, hang themselves, and so on. All three of the protagonists are restrained at one point or another, and it's only after realizing that they all feel equally alone and suicidal that they can come together for moments of human connection, mostly sexual. The film is very heavy-handed, and this dark plot is kind of bookended with two key scenes that drive its message home. So first, despite the plot revolving around the bisexual love triangle, we only meet the first of the three protagonists after 9 minutes of the film. The opening sequence is instead set in an office in a Moscow skyscraper, in a meeting between two cigar-smoking fat businessmen named Arnold and Lyonya. And off camera, one confesses that he has cancer of the scrotum. Soon after, Lyonya reveals that he's betrayed Arnold in a business deal with some Germans, and the two men brawl, they kind of roll around, they attempt to strangle each other, throw their weight at each other, and they threaten to report back to their mother about what happened. So apparently these two businessmen are brothers. So this scene kind of immediately establishes the key discourses that will be read through bisexuality in the film. Russia's apparently cancerous crisis of masculinity and the corruption of the older generation by foreign money, causing traditional family values, a very favorite phrase of the Russian state nowadays, to fail. Throughout the film, scenes of those two fighting in the office are interspersed with the main plot. Secondly, the movie ends with Venya realizing that he, Vika, and Rostik, so the love triangle members, are all actually siblings. They're the children of one of these businessmen. So when his psychiatrist tells him that he's not to blame for the incest because he wasn't aware of the blood relation at the time, Venya asks the final line of the film, "And who is to blame?" So the director is obviously suggesting that it is their parents' generation, right? The fathers who have failed their children on the psychosexual front, too obsessed with wealth to run a family. And according to the logic of the narrative, Venya's bisexuality is just another symptom of his turbulent upbringing, a sign of his mental instability and his inability to distinguish correctly between those he should and should not desire, be it members of the same sex or of the same family. Today's men evidently cannot live up to the legacy of Soviet male icons like the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, whose framed portrait is held up above the main characters when they're kissing and recording themselves in the bathtub, as you can see here. In conclusion, these films adopt wildly different tones and demonstrate radically diverging understandings of bisexuality and overall attitudes to queerness. Yet in reflecting on the impact of the dissolution of the Soviet Union on Russian society, both films employ bisexual plots and characters to explore anxieties about the homosexualizing influence of foreign powers on Russia, primarily the US. These include the perceived crisis of masculinity, as well as drastic, rapid economic and political shifts thought to have weakened the nation and the men who are supposed to lead it. And this is a theme that runs throughout cinema and literature in general, like especially queer ones. I've shown that bisexuality is mobilized to interrogate the compatibility of queerness with Russian national identity, positioning a bisexual man caught between imported queer fashions and native heteronormative traditions due to market forces. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rowan, for a very fascinating, albeit a bit scary set of movies.
Yeah.
There was a plot twist at the end we did not expect. So I've seen comments on the chat and people wanting to see, like really wanting to watch them, me included. So
Great.
Thank you, but I'm afraid also not, because of the general vibe these movies were giving. So I don't see our fourth speaker in the room. So maybe we can just have a moment for questions to our three speakers. So feel free to put them in the chat if you don't want to open your mic or camera, or just raise your hand and we will give you the floor. This ice-breaking moment. It is indeed the first panel of the day. We wait another couple of seconds. If not, oh, I have questions, but well, I may start with something that maybe all of you, I mean, with very different case studies, which I very much enjoyed. I mean, this is something that we discuss a lot in bisexual representation, which is that fine line between commercial aspects of having to reach a wide audience and then the deep hope to see ourselves represented on the screen, and the idea that this usually happens either with very violent stories, such as the last ones, or stories that are filled with a lot of, I don't know, anguish, not even anxiety. Sometimes it's in not so perfect stories, such as the ones that Koshi talked about. And for Heartstopper, I believe that this was one of the very first times where people felt at least somehow represented. But how do you see this line moving in the future in your areas between the commercial aspect of having to reach a wide audience and desperately wanting some bi-representation that is better than the ones that we have today? You know, a simple and easy question just to break the ice. I see Kush's hand.
I feel like, of course, the idea always comes back to like who is the money coming from, right? And who is defining the idea of what a commercial success is. If we think of the sources of funding and the fact that there are, I mean, just talking in the context of India, right? The fact that there are Western studios who are trying to decide what the Indian audience will want to see is, I think, something that needs to change. Because it's sort of like people who are not part of the community deciding what the community might want. Also, I think something is this idea of minority, but in the case of India, even if queer people are a quote unquote minority, and if we go by latest statistics, about 16% of Gen Z identifies as queer around the world, that would still be lakhs of people. Lakhs is like hundreds of thousands of people. So, I mean, yeah, I think it's about making cinema more accessible and about re-examining sources of art funding in general in the subcontinent, and how we can do better and give more space to queer people to tell their own stories. Yeah. I don't know if that answers it completely, but I tried to come from like, yeah, what we could.
No, thank you. Thank you for the answer.
I'm happy to go next. I have a quick answer because if we're talking about Russian context specifically, you now just can't produce those movies without risking kind of like fines, prison, all this kind of stuff, because the ban on gay propaganda that was introduced nationally in 2013, where you couldn't talk about any LGBT topics in front of anyone under the age of 18, was extended to the whole population after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So now you just can't talk about it, and they've also decreed that the international LGBT movement, of which I guess we're all a part, is an extremist organization. So it's considered terrorism now to create this stuff in Russia. Even after 2013, it was getting harder to produce anything LGBT, and people were kind of doing it, like activists were making things with crowdsourced funding, putting it straight online. But since all of these laws have kind of harshened, a lot of content that was out there and had been shown at international film festivals was just available on YouTube has been deleted, unfortunately. So we do still have access to some of it because, you know, people have archived things, and sometimes things have been delisted rather than deleted, but often things are just kind of disappearing, and it's really unclear how this kind of source material can be made in Russian inside of Russia, maybe abroad. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you also for the update on a particularly distressing situation.
I maybe just have one last thing to add. I mean, in the case of Heartstopper, it's been a huge success. Even though we don't have exact statistics from Netflix, they don't tend to release those. Also not demographics, so we don't actually know if Heartstopper has a majority queer audience or whether there are a lot of sort of straight allies watching it as well. So I think that complicates the matter of what is a commercial success and what is the target audience and who is it actually reaching. I think it would really help if we had those statistics. But I think also shows like Heartstopper, other shows with queer main characters that have come out in the last couple of years have really shown that there is appeal, and there is an interest in those. Unfortunately, we tend to see those with queer female characters being cancelled still. So I think there is a case of sort of favoring queer male characters over queer female characters, but I'm hoping that things are changing in the future.
Yes, there is always the gender identity to take into consideration when we're dealing with this sort of things. So I see a question in the chat by T. So they ask, what do you think accounts for that we are getting fewer films with queer representation? Well, for Rowan's case, I would say that, I mean, the word getting worse and worse, but maybe, I don't know if that was a specific question for Kushi.
I think in the context of India, I would say we're actually getting more queer representation now. The problem is that with the decriminalization of Section 377, the immediate focus of people who want to tell those stories has been to go with single gender attraction. Even some really good, nuanced portrayals that we're getting, especially on OTT platforms like Netflix, Amazon, Hotstar, because they don't have that much of a way to perform at the box office. They are very focused on just basically narrowing it down to the idea of people can only be attracted to one gender, because the assumption is that people who don't know anything about the queer community won't be able to understand multi-gender attraction. So I think that the problem is not the number of films. Of course, there need to be so many more, but also that the films that are being made, the shows that are being made, need to have more inclusivity and intersectionality within them.
Yeah. So I see some comments. Just want to read them. So John says, I think things got worse in UK, USA because it's quite low. So small like single series ending with lots of representation make a big difference. And I mean, of course, Rowan, you mentioned that series get bigger fandoms than films, which, yes, for sure. So when you gather a fandom that is very active, such as the one that Heartstopper has, for sure this has meant support and then people rooting for the characters. And this usually comes from like Anglophone media most of the time. So those are the movies and the series that get the more attention, even globally speaking. Okay, so I think we have to close the panel because we have reached our time. I want to thank the speakers, Meret, Kushi, and Rowan, for their wonderful presentations. It was a pleasure to chair this first panel of the day.